The Billionaire's Runaway Bride Part 3. Chapter 14, A Midnight Rooftop Confrontation. The masquerade had reached that peculiar stage of the night when the edges of reality began to soften, the chandeliers seemed to hang lower, the music wound itself deeper into the guests' bones, and the laughter was just a touch too loud to be entirely sober. It was nearly midnight. Sophie had danced with diplomats and been offered champagne by people whose names she hadn't caught. The silver-masked man had vanished as suddenly as he'd appeared, but the note in her gown's hidden pocket felt heavier with every passing hour. "He's hiding something." The words kept looping in her mind, each repetition sharpening their edges. She found Alexander near the grand staircase, speaking in low tones to a man she recognized from the yacht, an investor, perhaps, or one of those friends whose smiles never reached their eyes. His mask was still perfectly in place, his posture relaxed, but she'd been around him long enough to recognize the set of his jaw when something was gnawing at him. When he spotted her, his gaze flicked over her, a quick sweep that was half habit, half something else, before he excused himself from his companion. "You look like you need air," he said. "Maybe I do," she replied, her voice lighter than she felt. Without another word, he led her up a narrow staircase she hadn't noticed before, hidden behind a velvet curtain near the back of the ballroom. The stone steps wound upward, the muffled music trailing after them until it was nothing but a faint hum. They emerged onto the rooftop. The air was cooler here, touched with the brine of the nearby sea. Above them, the sky was a deep, endless blue-black, scattered with 1,000 stars. The glow from the ballroom's lanterns spilled faintly onto the terrace, but beyond that, it was darkness, the kind of darkness that made the world feel smaller and more intimate. From up here, Sophie could see the curve of the coastline and the silver glint of the water under the moon. The palace's stone balustrade framed it all like a painting. Alexander moved to stand beside her, his mask still in place, though the dim light softened its edges. "So," he said quietly, "tell me what's on your mind." She glanced at him, weighing her words. "Why do you think something is?" "Because you've been scanning the room all night," he replied. "You've been watching more than you've been enjoying yourself. And because I know when someone is holding something back." She hesitated, the note like a burning coal in her pocket. Part of her wanted to confront him outright, to demand an explanation for the stranger's warning. But another part, the part that had learned the rules of power from her family's drawing rooms, knew that showing her hand too soon might be a mistake. Instead, she said, "I've been wondering, why did you really want me here tonight?" He turned toward her fully now, the dark gleam of his eyes visible through the mask. "I told you. Whoever's been watching us, whoever leaked those photographs, likes to play in the shadows. This kind of event draws them out." "That's the official answer," she said. "What's the real one?" For a long moment, he didn't speak. The only sound was the faint rustle of the wind against the stone. Then, he stepped closer, close enough that she could see the slight shadow of stubble along his jaw, smell the faint trace of sandalwood and something darker on his skin. "The real one," he said, his voice low, "is that I wanted to see how you'd move in my world. Not just in public, but under pressure. I wanted to see if you'd play the role, or if you'd make it your own." Her pulse kicked harder, not entirely from the words. And he said, his mouth curving just slightly, "You don't blend in. You stand out. Which makes you a liability, and an asset." She almost laughed at the contradiction. "That sounds like something you'd say about a stock portfolio." He tilted his head. "In my world, people are investments. Some pay dividends. Some cost more than they're worth. And some, his gaze dipped briefly to her mouth before returning to her eyes. Some change the game entirely. The rooftop suddenly felt much smaller. Sophie's heart thudded hard against her ribs, but she held his gaze. And which one am I? He smiled, slow, deliberate, unreadable. That's what I'm still deciding. Before she could respond, a burst of laughter floated up from the ballroom, followed by the swell of music as a new dance began. It broke the moment, but not the tension. Alexander turned away first, looking out over the dark curve of the sea. "We should go back," he said, though his tone suggested he wasn't eager to. Sophie followed him toward the stairs, her mind a tangle of questions and warnings. He's hiding something. But now, she realized, the more dangerous truth might be that she was starting to care less about what he was hiding, and more about why it mattered to her at all. Chapter 15, The Second Leak. The first sound Sophie heard was the sea. A slow, steady rhythm outside the balcony doors, softer than the rush of waves she'd heard from the yacht but just as insistent. It was morning in Mallorca, the kind of bright, crystalline day that should have made the whole world feel clean. She almost let herself believe it would be. Then the knock came. It wasn't Lucia's polite tap-tap. This was a sharp, deliberate rap, 3 beats in quick succession. Before Sophie could answer, the door opened and Alexander stepped inside without waiting for permission. He was already dressed, tailored trousers, open-collared white shirt, but there was none of his usual smooth composure. His movements were tight, his expression carved from something harder than stone. "You need to see this," he said, and crossed to her without preamble, a tablet in his hand. Sophie pushed herself up against the pillows, the sheet sliding down to her waist. She took the tablet, her fingers brushing his, and the screen lit up with a headline that hit her like a bucket of ice water. "Runaway bride's new fiancé cheated on, midnight masquerade tryst." Beneath it was a photograph. Not from the gala's grand ballroom. Not from the rooftop with Alexander. This was something else entirely. She was standing near the marble staircase, she remembered it vividly now, but the angle was different, higher, as though taken from one of the balconies. In the picture, the silver-masked stranger was beside her, leaning in, his gloved hand barely touching hers. To anyone who hadn't been there, it could easily be read as something intimate, or illicit. She scrolled down, her stomach tightening. The second image was worse, a cropped close-up of the folded parchment in her hand, the paper half hidden in the sweep of her gown but visible enough to raise questions. The caption beneath it dripped with speculation, a note from a secret admirer. Or something more dangerous. This is, she stopped herself, because the word she wanted, impossible, was one she'd already used after the first leak. "It's precise," Alexander said, his voice low but edged. Too precise to be chance. They were close enough to get that shot of the note without you noticing. Which means they knew exactly where you'd be and when. Sophie set the tablet on the duvet, her hands suddenly restless. "If this gets out to your investors." "It's already out," he cut in. "Half the people I spoke to at the ball have seen it. My PR team's trying to frame it as nothing, but this," he gestured to the image of the stranger leaning in toward her. "This is exactly the kind of distraction my rivals want to sell. A fiancé they can paint as reckless, disloyal. The deal I've been building for months could go soft in a day if enough people start whispering." Her cheeks burned, not just from anger but from the realization of how easily her presence could be weaponized against him. "I didn't know that man." I didn't. I know you didn't. Alexander's tone softened slightly. But in my world, perception matters more than truth. And someone out there understands that very well. She exhaled slowly, leaning back against the headboard. You think it's the same person who took the penthouse photos? Yes. And now they've decided you're the easier target. He paused, his eyes narrowing. Which means you're not just a liability to them, you're a threat. That's why they're trying to undermine you before you can find your footing. The words landed with a strange, electric weight. A threat. It was almost flattering, if she ignored the gnawing twist in her stomach. Then what do we do? She asked. Alexander's answer was immediate. We make it clear we're stronger together than apart. No more gaps in our story. No more moments when you're alone in the crowd. If they're watching for weakness, we give them none to see. She thought of the stranger's note, he's hiding something, and the way it had burned against her palm. But she didn't bring it up. Not yet. Instead, she met his gaze and nodded. Then we don't give them anything to use. For a moment, his expression shifted, something like approval flickering behind his eyes, before the mask of control settled back into place. Good, he said. Because I have a feeling this was only their opening move. And as she watched him leave the room, Sophie knew with unsettling certainty that whoever was behind the leaks wasn't done, and that the next strike might not just aim for Alexander's reputation, but for her. Chapter 16, Suspicions and Shadows. The night after the second leak, the penthouse felt different. Quieter. But not with the peaceful kind of quiet Sophie had enjoyed in her first days there. This was the sort of stillness that seemed to listen, that hummed faintly with the sense of being observed. Alexander had left early for a string of meetings, his parting instructions sharp and precise: stay in the building. Keep a low profile. Sophie had nodded, but his caution only made her restless. She'd never been good at standing still when there were unanswered questions circling her. By early evening, the restlessness had won. The penthouse's lower levels were a maze of rooms she hadn't yet explored, sleek conference spaces, a glass-walled library, a private gym, and, tucked behind a mirrored corridor, a smaller reception area that felt more like a luxury hotel lobby than part of someone's home. It was here she first heard the voices. At first it was only a low murmur, the kind of background sound she might have dismissed as staff talking in the distance. But then she caught a name. Alexander's. She froze just beyond the corner, her sandals silent on the carpet. The voices were coming from behind a half-open door that led into one of the smaller meeting lounges. He won't suspect anything until it's too late, a man's voice said, low and quick. Sophie edged closer, just enough to glimpse the room through the narrow gap. Raphael. She recognized him instantly, Alexander's assistant, always hovering at the edge of important conversations, his manner quiet, efficient, loyal. At least, she had thought loyal. Now he was standing too close to Mariana del Rio, their heads inclined toward each other in the kind of conspiratorial posture that sent a cold shiver down Sophie's spine. Mariana was dressed in a fitted cream dress, her hair sleek, her makeup perfect, not the kind of look someone wore for an impromptu visit. She stood with one hand on the back of a leather chair, her other holding a phone she seemed to be scrolling without really looking at it. He's distracted, Mariana said. Her voice had that same lazy precision Sophie had heard on the yacht, the sound of someone who knew exactly how much weight their words carried. The girl is doing her job better than expected. Public opinion is split, but the seed is there. Now all we need is. Raphael cut in, his tone taut. We need timing. If we push too soon, it'll backfire. Let her stay in the picture long enough to make him believe she matters. That's when we. Sophie's pulse hammered so hard she barely caught the rest. She pressed herself flat against the wall, every instinct telling her to leave before they caught her listening. But her feet refused to move. And the deal? Mariana asked. Raphael's answer was quick, certain. If it collapses, he's exposed. Vulnerable. He'll have no choice but to. His voice dropped, and Sophie couldn't make out the last words. Mariana smiled faintly, the kind of smile that didn't reach her eyes. Then we keep our course. The sound of a chair shifting snapped Sophie's focus. They were moving. She ducked back into the mirrored corridor, slipping behind one of the tall decorative panels just as footsteps approached. Through the narrow gap, she saw them leave the lounge, Mariana first, Raphael following, their conversation now just low hums in the air. They didn't notice her. She waited until their footsteps faded before exhaling. Her fingers were tight around the seam of her dress, her mind racing. If Raphael was feeding Mariana information, or worse, working with her, then the leaks weren't just about embarrassing Alexander. They were part of something bigger, something aimed at dismantling his position entirely. And if Mariana's comment about the girl had been about her, then Sophie wasn't just a bystander in their plan. She was a piece they were moving on the board. Back upstairs, she sat in the darkened living room, staring at the city lights. She could confront Alexander, tell him exactly what she'd seen. But a small, cautious voice inside her urged patience. If she revealed her knowledge too soon, Raphael and Mariana might cover their tracks, and she'd lose any chance of catching them outright. For now, she'd keep it to herself. But as she watched the lights flicker on the sea, Sophie made herself a quiet promise: if they thought she was an easy pawn, they were about to learn she could play the game too. Chapter 17, A Trap is Set. By the following afternoon, Sophie had made her decision. She wasn't going to tell Alexander about overhearing Raphael and Mariana, not yet. She needed proof, and proof meant catching them in the act. But she couldn't do it alone, not in a world where appearances meant everything and rumors traveled faster than truth. That was why she was sitting across from Alexander in the penthouse sunlit dining room, a cup of coffee cooling between her hands, watching him read through the latest financial report on his tablet. He looked as he always did when working, focused, controlled, untouchable, but Sophie had been around him long enough to know that wasn't the whole story. Beneath the polished exterior, there was a constant alertness, a readiness to pivot. If she could get him to use that focus in the right way, they might have a chance of drawing Raphael and Mariana out. "I have an idea," she said finally. Alexander glanced up, one eyebrow lifting in that small, deliberate way he had when he was prepared to humor someone but not necessarily agree with them. "An idea for what?" "For finding out who's leaking to the press," she said, leaning forward slightly. "And proving it." He set the tablet down. "Go on." "We give them something to leak," she said. "Something irresistible. Something that looks like trouble between us. If they think we're fighting, that we're about to fall apart, they'll act on it. Push harder. Maybe even make their next move too soon." Alexander didn't speak right away. He sat back in his chair, studying her with that unsettling stillness he used when weighing whether someone was worth letting into his plans. "You want to bait them," he said at last. "Yes," she replied. "A staged argument." Something in public, but not so public that it looks fake. We let them believe they've caught us in a real moment." His mouth curved slightly, not quite a smile, but close. "You're thinking like them now. Is that a compliment?" "It's a warning," he said. But there was approval in his tone, and a glint in his eyes she hadn't seen before. They spent the next hour working out the details. It had to be somewhere crowded enough to be worth photographing but private enough to control who was around. Alexander suggested an upscale restaurant near the marina, one with floor-to-ceiling windows that made every table visible from the street. Sophie countered with the idea of having one of his known associates accidentally spot them there and make a call to the right gossip outlet. "And the argument?" she asked. "We make it believable," he said, his voice turning cool and precise. "I'll say something sharp enough to sting, you'll react like it's the last straw. You leave first. I'll follow," looking unsettled. She frowned. "And if someone overhears?" "That's the point," he replied. The plan was set for the following evening. When the night came, Sophie dressed in a deep burgundy wrap dress that skimmed her figure without looking overly staged. Alexander wore a navy suit, no tie, relaxed enough to seem like a dinner date, but sharp enough for the cameras. The restaurant's host ushered them to a table near the window, and Sophie could already feel the weight of a few lingering glances. She played her part, leaning in at first, smiling faintly, sipping her wine as though everything was perfect. Then Alexander's tone shifted. It was subtle at first, a slightly clipped answer to a harmless question, a faint edge in his voice. Sophie responded in kind, her brows drawing together, her voice lowering just enough to suggest tension without making the words audible to anyone outside their table. The pauses between their sentences grew longer, heavier. She let her hand fall from the stem of her glass and onto the table, as though bracing herself. He leaned back, exhaled slowly, and looked away, the kind of gesture that could be read as either defeat or dismissal. It was the signal. Sophie stood abruptly, her chair scraping back just enough to draw a few eyes. She didn't speak, didn't linger, just gathered her clutch and strode toward the door, her posture sharp with indignation. As she stepped outside into the warm night air, she caught a glimpse of movement across the street. A figure, camera in hand, ducked slightly behind a parked car, the lens glinting under the streetlight. Perfect. Moments later, Alexander emerged, his expression carefully unreadable, and followed her to the waiting car. They didn't speak until the doors closed and the city lights began to blur past. "They took the bait," Sophie said, her pulse still quick from the performance. "Yes," Alexander replied, his voice cool but edged with satisfaction. "Now we see who bites first." And as the car curved back toward the penthouse, Sophie knew the trap had been set, not just for the saboteur, but for the truth itself. Chapter 18, The Unmasking. The air inside the old Mallorcan ballroom felt charged, as though the gold-leafed walls themselves were holding their breath. It was midnight, the appointed hour when masks would be lifted, secrets hinted at all evening finally allowed to meet the light. The guests were already gathering in a loose circle, their silks and satins whispering against the marble floor, their jeweled masks glimmering under the chandelier's spill of light. Sophie stood at Alexander's side, her own mask, a filigree of black metal studded with tiny onyx stones, still in place. She could feel the steady warmth of his hand at the small of her back, anchoring her in the middle of the crush. The staged argument from the night before had done its job. Since then, she'd felt the eyes on her in every room, the watchful glances when she and Alexander entered together, the slight hum of speculation in conversations that stopped too quickly. Whoever had been feeding the press was paying attention. And tonight, Alexander had decided it was time to close the net. The master of ceremonies, a man in a silver cloak and an elaborate half-mask shaped like a falcon, stepped into the center of the crowd and raised a hand. "Senoras y senors, the moment has come. At the stroke of 12, we see one another as we truly are." A ripple of anticipation moved through the room. Sophie's gaze swept the crowd, and there, by the far column, half in shadow, was Raphael. He was speaking to Mariana del Rio, her crimson mask echoing the memory of the first night Sophie had seen her. They were close, too close for the kind of polite small talk they might claim. Raphael's posture was stiff, his eyes flicking occasionally toward Alexander. The clock began its deep, resonant chime. 1. Guests began to untie ribbons, lift feathers, peel away leather and lace. 2. A gold mask fell into a waiting hand. 3. A cascade of laughter from a cluster of women in sapphire gowns. 4. Sophie's fingers brushed the ties at the back of her own mask, but she didn't move to undo them yet. She was watching Raphael. 5. He shifted, as though preparing to slip away before the unmasking could catch him. Mariana's lips moved, a quick, sharp word Sophie couldn't hear. 6. Alexander's hand tightened slightly at her back. Now he murmured. 7. They began to move, crossing the room with unhurried steps that cut straight through the crowd. 8. Raphael turned. His eyes met Sophie's for a split second, widening just enough to betray the flicker of alarm. 9. Alexander reached him first, a hand closing firmly around Raphael's arm. The movement was casual enough to pass for camaraderie, but there was no mistaking the steel in it. 10. The crowd's chatter softened. Heads began to turn. 11. Leaving so soon? Alexander asked, his voice low, almost amused. 12. The last chime faded, and Alexander pulled the mask from Raphael's face. It was a simple black half-mask, and beneath it, Raphael's expression was caught between defiance and calculation. For a heartbeat, no one spoke. Then Alexander said, clearly enough for those closest to hear, "You've been busy." A murmur rippled outward through the guests. Sophie felt her pulse spike, but she held her ground, meeting Raphael's gaze without flinching. "I don't know what you think," Raphael began, but Alexander cut him off with a small shake of his head. "Don't insult me. Or yourself. You were at the penthouse when those first photos appeared. You were at the masquerade when this was taken." He tilted his head toward Sophie, and she felt the shift in the crowd as eyes landed on her. Raphael's mouth opened, then closed. The flicker of something like resignation crossed his face. "You don't understand," he said finally. "I wasn't working alone." Alexander's expression didn't change. "Then perhaps you'd like to tell everyone who your partner is." The silence stretched, taut and expectant. Mariana's hand closed briefly over her champagne flute, the only sign she might be holding her breath. Raphael's eyes flicked toward her, quick, almost imperceptible. But Sophie saw it. She knew Alexander saw it too. And just like that, the unmasking was no longer about satin and lace. It was about the sharp, invisible lines between loyalty and betrayal. Chapter 19, A Twist in the Betrayal. The silence in the ballroom had a weight to it now, thick, expectant, as if the very air knew something was about to shift. Raphael stood with his mask gone, his arm still caught in Alexander's unyielding grip. Around them, Guests hovered in a shimmering ring of silk and glass, champagne flutes frozen halfway to lips, fans and gloves hanging motionless. The chandelier's golden light washed over it all, glittering on sequins and diamonds but leaving the shadows at the edges of the room darker still. "Who?" Alexander said, his voice pitched just loud enough to carry, "helped you?" Raphael hesitated. Sophie could see it, the quick dart of his gaze around the room, as if he was weighing the safest direction to run. But there was no running here, not with every path blocked by eyes and ears hungry for revelation. "Say it," Alexander pressed, the words like the tightening of a knot. For a moment, Sophie thought Raphael would resist. His jaw worked, his mouth opening as if to shape a lie. Then, with the smallest shrug, a gesture that seemed almost to admit defeat, he said, "Lord Percival Harrow." It was as if the name itself cracked through the glittering surface of the night. A ripple of murmurs swept through the guests, elegant masks still clutched in their hands as they leaned toward one another, whispering over the music that had quietly died. Sophie felt her chest tighten. Even though she'd suspected Percival was involved somehow, his sudden appearance in Spain, his cryptic warning, hearing it said aloud sent a chill through her bones. Alexander's grip didn't falter. "You're telling me," he said evenly, "that my former assistant has been working with the man my fiancé left at the altar?" Raphael gave a humorless laugh, though there was no confidence in it now. "You make it sound personal." "It wasn't. Percival offered me more than you ever could, money, yes, but also opportunity. He wanted your latest acquisition to fail, and I was in a position to help." "How?" Alexander's voice was calm, but Sophie recognized the control in it, the calm of someone who could lose his temper but refused to give the audience that satisfaction. "By making you look distracted. Weak." Raphael's gaze flicked briefly toward Sophie. "A sudden romance. A runaway bride. The perfect scandal to cloud judgment and spook your investors. My job was to make sure the press had the right photographs at the right time, and to encourage certain whispers in the market." Sophie's stomach turned. "So the leaks, the photos, the note. All part of the same strategy," Raphael said, cutting her off. "And it worked, didn't it? You've spent more time putting out fires than focusing on your deal." The crowd had gone very still. Even Mariana, poised and composed, was no longer trying to hide her interest. Alexander released Raphael's arm, but the gesture was no kindness, it was the deliberate letting go of a man who knew he had all the leverage. "Security will see you out," he said, his tone final. Two men in dark suits moved forward from the edge of the crowd, guiding Raphael toward the exit. But as he passed Sophie, he slowed just enough to meet her eyes. "It was never really about him," he said quietly. "It was about you." Before she could respond, he was gone, swallowed by the shadows beyond the ballroom's arched doors. Alexander turned toward her then, and though his expression was steady, there was a glint in his eyes, not of victory, but of the knowledge that this was far from over. Because if Percival was behind this, then the next move wouldn't come from a hired assistant. It would come from Percival himself. And Sophie had the sinking feeling he wouldn't be content with whispers and photographs anymore. Chapter 20, The Storm Before the Vows. Mallorca's coastline had disappeared under a curtain of rain. The storm had blown in fast from the sea, the kind that didn't ease in with a drizzle but arrived all at once, thick, slanting sheets of water that blurred the horizon into a smear of grey. Wind rattled the shutters of the small cliffside villa Alexander had rented for the night, its whitewashed walls now slick and glistening under the onslaught. Inside, Sophie stood near the tall arched window, watching the surf below smash against the rocks in bursts of white foam. Every crash seemed to echo inside her chest. The air was heavy with the smell of salt and wet stone. Somewhere in the house, a clock ticked steadily, too slow for the thud of her pulse. Alexander was in the next room, speaking into his phone in that clipped, decisive tone he used for business conversations. His words were in Spanish, too quick for Sophie to catch all of them, but she knew by the sharpness in his voice that they were about Raphael's confession, about Percival's name being dragged into the open. She was still replaying the scene from the masquerade, Raphael's final words circling in her mind like a hawk. It was never really about him. It was about you. The knock on the villa's front door was almost drowned out by the wind. At first, she thought she'd imagined it. But then it came again, 3 sharp raps, deliberate and heavy, as if the person outside had no intention of leaving until it was answered. Alexander appeared in the doorway to the sitting room, his phone now silent in his hand. He gave her a look that was both questioning and wary, then moved toward the door. Sophie followed, her bare feet silent against the tiled floor. When he pulled the door open, rain swept in on the wind, scattering droplets across the marble entryway. And standing there, framed by the storm, was Lord Percival Harrow. He wore a dark overcoat, the collar turned up against the wind, his silver hair damp but still immaculate. The rain slicked the shoulders of his coat, but he didn't seem bothered. His pale eyes, cool, unblinking, locked on Sophie immediately, ignoring Alexander entirely for the first few seconds. "You've been busy," Percival said, his voice carrying easily over the howl of the wind. Sophie felt her spine stiffen. "You've been spying." "I've been informed," he replied smoothly. "And I'm here to give you one last chance to stop this madness before it destroys you." Alexander stepped forward then, his presence filling the doorway, the air between the two men crackling like the charged sky above. "You've already done enough damage," he said, his voice low but edged. "I should have expected the leaks, the interference, but sending Raphael was sloppy." Percival's mouth curved in a smile that didn't touch his eyes. "You think this is over because you caught your errand boy? My dear Alexander, that was just the first act." Sophie moved to stand beside Alexander. The rain was soaking the hem of her dress, but she didn't care. "You need to leave." Percival looked at her then, really looked at her, his gaze steady and unyielding. "I told you in the square you'd regret running away from me. And now you're standing beside a man whose life is built on enemies and leverage. You may think you've escaped me, Sophie, but you've only stepped into something worse." The words hit harder than she wanted to admit, partly because they echoed the warning she'd once dismissed. But she lifted her chin, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. "I would rather lose everything than go back to you." For the first time, Percival's expression shifted, not with hurt, but with something colder. "A decision. Then I suppose I'll have to make sure you lose it," he said softly. A flash of lightning split the sky behind him, the thunder rolling over the cliff a heartbeat later. And then, without waiting for an answer, he stepped back into the storm. The wind caught his coat, snapping it like a banner, and the rain swallowed him in seconds, his figure dissolving into the blur between sea and sky. Alexander closed the door with a solid, final thud. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the sound of the storm pressing in on all sides. Then Alexander said, "He won't stop now." Sophie nodded slowly, her pulse still pounding. "Then neither will we." And as the lightning lit the sea outside, she realized the vows they were meant to speak soon, words of trust, of unity, were no longer just ceremonial. They were a line in the sand. That's the end of this part, but trust me, the next one is even more thrilling. We drop fresh episodes every day, so don't miss out. Like, subscribe, and stay tuned, you won't want to miss what's coming next.
Because every broken heart deserves a comeback. If this story touched you, don't forget to subscribe for more emotional romance every week. Hit like, drop a comment, and ring the bell so you never miss a moment of romance, redemption, and powerful love. And don't keep the drama to yourself, share this story with someone who lives for twists just like you. Thanks for listening, and remember, sometimes the best comeback is becoming unforgettable.